it was very well received. And that encouraged us to bring Eric here, drag him out of his local home, feed him a little bit of food over, and feed him over at Brothers Deli, our favorite pond. You're welcome. With that, I'm going to let Eric start, and if you want to say more about yourself, go right ahead. And at the end, you can actually purchase his book, which I encourage.
Thank you, Ben.
Thank you.
We're gonna have to turn that on. People want to see my.
Oh, sure, it's an on button. Speaking of.
This is an intimate crowd. This is. Appreciate your coming out. We can get this to work. So Laura, tomorrow when I call you and say I left my phone here, it's right here. Okay.
I can see it. Oh, there it is.
Good. Everyone good? All right. Well, first of all, good evening. Thanks for dinner. Thanks for that nice introduction. I'll talk a little bit about my background as we move through this, but I guess I would say I'm one of those people who likes and understands history best when I can visit it. There's a famous recent Broadway play about being in a room where it happened. If I could just be near the rock where it happened, lots of times I can understand the event better. So the book we wrote in 1999 is a travelogue. Right? It was originally published in '99. It was republished in 2017. We got Nat Philbrick to write a foreword for us. I had done the reading for the Mayflower, the King Philip's War section for him, so we traded favors, and he wrote the foreword for us. We researched the book before there was Google and GPS and drones, so it meant driving all over New England and spending time with local town historians, and also spending time with local Native American historians, folks like Nana Poshman and Russell Gardner and Ella Sekata of the Narragansett. And with their help, I was able to find and map many of the locations associated with the war if they hadn't been obliterated by a parking lot. I have maybe 45 minutes of material. If you need to get up and move around or whatever, I'm not offended at all. I gave a talk about King Philip in 2000 in Mattapoisett. And I brought along our 5-year-old daughter, she's 30 now or 31 or something like that. And she sat in the back of the room coloring very nicely while I did the talk. And I thought everything went well. And about a month later, Sue and I, my wife and I, were visiting her Boxford school where they had her do journal entries. And this was one of the pages. It says, "Yesterday, my dad told a speech in Mattapoisett. It was a little boring. I yawned 3 times and gulped twice. At the last hour, he showed slides." And there I am, looking rather skinny, I might add. But that's the only good thing about this page. King Philip's War, blah, 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 blah. And I wrote it, blah, blah. So that has kept me humble all these years. And a reminder that my job is not to have you gulp too much while I'm talking. Why King Philip? Okay, I grew up in North Dighton. Council Oak was that way in Central Dighton. King Philip's Oak was that way in Taunton. And I would come home on the bus from Dighton Rehoboth Regional High School and go by this place called Anawan Rock. And then I got to study history at Brown, and I took a material culture course with Clint Dietz, who was at Plymouth Plantation at the time, and he talked all about this thing called King Philip's War. We visited Brown's Half-and-Ruffer Museum in Bristol and walked over to this rock formation called the seat of Metacom. So I grew up with the ghosts of King Philip's War all around me. And when I had the opportunity to write about it, I realized that the last best thing, and this is back in about 1990 when I started, the last best thing that had been written about the war was a generation old, and it had been published in 1958 by Douglas Leach, Flintlock and Tomahawk. It was Professor Leach's PhD thesis. He wrote it at Harvard under the direction of Samuel Eliot Morison, a pretty good pedigree. It's a book I still highly recommend to people. Professor Leach was not only a good historian, but he was a real gentleman. I sent him our draft And he was nearly 80 years old. He was suffering from leukemia, which I did not know at the time. And he went through the entire draft and marked it up for us, and then wrote a blurb for the book. So whenever I think about being a generous gentleman, I think about Professor Leach. Before we get to the sites in the book, we offered the reader a brief overview of the war. I suspect that some of you know a lot about the war, but just so we're all on the same page, let me spend a little bit of time on chronology and context. Pilgrims land in 1620, American Revolution is in 1776, and King Philip's War was fought in southern New England in 1675 and 1676. Now, it will continue on in northern New England through what's called the Treaty of Casco in 1678. There's a lot of history there, but not a lot of sites. So I'm going to focus on the southern theater tonight. If you do some quick math, you'll find that we are approaching the 350th anniversary of the war in 2025. So if you're thinking of writing your own book, now is a good time to start. The war pitted about 60,000 English in New England who were voracious for land and rapidly spreading against perhaps 20,000 Native Americans who had occupied the land for thousands of years. And it is the beginning of a larger pattern of conflict that will determine whether the English or the Dutch or the French or the Native Americans will possess this part of North America. So King Philip's War will be followed by the series of wars, all of which lead up to the American Revolution. The three native tribes that prosecute the war in southern New England are the Wampanoag, perhaps 1,000 at the time of the war, which includes Philip's people, the Pokanoket, based around Bristol and Warren, Rhode Island, Weetamos, Pecasset in Fall River, and Awashonk-Sakonnet in Little Compton. The Narragansett, we think maybe 4,000 in total. These are squishy numbers. In modern-day Rhode Island, the strongest of all the Native American tribes as the war begins. And the Nipmuc, perhaps 3,000 in number in central Massachusetts. And then later to the north, the Abenaki will get involved, and the Pecumtuck out in the Connecticut River Valley. So to get to 2,000, you would add the Pennacook, the Pequot, the Mohegan, some of whom fought on the side of the English, the Massachusetts, and those Native Americans who made their home on Cape Cod and the islands. Massachusetts won't exist until 1692, New Hampshire until 1776, and Maine until 1820. So at the time of King Philip's War, there is Plymouth Colony, what we call today the Old Colony, led by Governor Josiah Winslow. Massachusetts Bay, which is maybe half the population, led by Governor John Leverett. He is actually a veteran of the English Civil War. He fought with distinction under Cromwell, one of the few real soldiers in the colony. And Connecticut was led by Governor John Winthrop Jr., sometimes called the Younger, who established a settlement at Saybrook that launched the colony. And then there is this ragtag bunch of malcontents and cast-offs in this place called Rhode Island, who will also contribute to the war effort. If you think about the frontier in 1675, in Mass Bay, the outermost ring of settlements included Dunstable, Groton, Lancaster, Marlborough, Mendon, Medfield, and Rentham. And then there were these two isolated outposts. Worcester had maybe 7 families, and Brookfield about 20. And then there was the string of exposed settlements along the Connecticut River Valley from Northfield and Deerfield down to Springfield. In Plymouth Colony, Bridgewater and Taunton were certainly exposed, but the real frontier towns were Dartmouth, Swansea, and Rehoboth. And then you might say all of Connecticut and all of Rhode Island and all of modern-day Maine and New Hampshire were frontier, with English settlements that stretched all the way to Pembroke. Okay, let's look at some of the key individuals involved in the coalition of indigenous peoples that prosecute the war. The older woman in the center of this picture is Zerviah Gould. Born in 1807, she married Thomas Mitchell. They had 11 children. Here she is with 2 of her daughters, Melinda and Carlotta. Zerviah lived much of her life on Betty's Neck in Lakeville. And in 1856, she began a campaign to assert her rights to 4 lots of land in Fall River. And to make her case to the Commonwealth of Massachusetts, she needed to show her direct ancestral connection to Massasoit, who was, of course, the Wampanoag sachem who greeted the Pilgrims. So she partnered with local historian Ebenezer Pierce, who in 1878 published Indian History, Biography, and Genealogy. It's a monograph containing a history of King Philip's War, one of the few documents written thanks to Zerviah's influence with more of a Native American perspective. It's also a biography and a genealogy of Massasoit. You can find and read this book for free online. This is a simplified version of Massasoit's genealogy as it's laid out by Pierce and Gould. Massasoit, you know, is a title, meaning grand or great sachem. Usamiquin was his name. He had 4 children that we know for sure, but given the estimates of his age, this family might have been a second family for him. There's at least one theory that Usamequin's first family was wiped out by European disease, which we now think may have decimated as much as 90% of New England's native population in the century before the Pilgrims landed. The military has a concept called shaping the battlefield, which is a process of slowing and degrading the enemy before the battle starts. There's nothing that will shape the battlefield for King Philip's War like European disease. Another important factor was what historians now call the Great Puritan Migration. In 1630, Charles I dissolved Parliament, put Puritan leaders vulnerable to persecution. Their response was to form this thing called the Massachusetts Bay Colony. And the Winthrop fleet led the way for more than 20,000 men, women, and children to migrate over the next decade. It also turned out that conditions in the New World were healthier than many of the cities in Europe for raising a large family. So beginning in the 1620s, America has its first baby boom. New England's indigenous people weren't just crippled by European disease, they also faced a population that was growing rapidly by birth, and they began to recognize the existence of a supply chain that stretched back to a world that seemed to have an endless flow of people and resources. Massasoit's oldest son was Wamsutta, or Alexander. He married Weetamo. We'll say more about Wamsutta in a minute. Weetamo will drown in the Taunton River at Somerset trying to escape English soldiers in August of 1676, just before Philip is killed. Her head was stuck on a pike in Taunton. It was a gruesome tactic that both sides used to strike fear in their enemy. Lisa Brooks is a professor who teaches American Studies at Amherst College. Her book, Our Beloved Kin, takes an especially good look at the role that Weetamo played in the war, a role that has been traditionally overlooked and underappreciated. Massasoit also had a daughter, Amy, who married Tispaquin, who will fight in the war alongside Philip. Zerviah Gould Mitchell was descended from Amy, so that genealogical line is well documented in Pierce's monograph. If you visit Lakeville, you can find a small, peaceful, beautiful, and important graveyard, the Royal Wampanoag Cemetery. It includes some of Massasoit's descendants through Amy's line, and the last burial there was in 1812. And by the way, Zerviah Gould Mitchell was tenacious and courageous. She convinced Massachusetts of her lineage and her claims, and she won the land in Fall River. Massasoit's second son was Metacom, or Philip, who became known by the English as King Philip. The sachem was not a king, but that's the best of the imprecise term the English had. And it was the English who gave the name Alexander to Wamsutta and Philip to Metacom, which both men accepted. Perhaps it was a sign of respect, we're not sure. Metacom married Weetamo's sister, Wutanakanoosk, and the couple may have had 2 daughters, but we're sure they had a son, who our history books say was sold into Caribbean slavery with his mother after King Philip's War. There's an oral tradition that Philip's son slipped over the side of the ship and escaped to Canada. So there are people who claim descent from Massasoit, not only through his daughter, Amy, but through his son, but through Philip and his son. It's not unusual for me to receive a letter like this every so often. If you start right here, my great-grandfather was born in Niles, Michigan in 1873. And when he was 95 in 1968, he told my mom we were direct descendants of King Philip and he didn't want the family to forget. The descendants of Massasoit through Philip are sometimes called the Royal House of Pokanaka. Brown University is home to a new initiative called Stolen Relations. It's a community-based collaborative effort to build a database of enslaved and unfree indigenous people across all the Americas. So in 1661, Massasoit died of natural causes. He presided over about 40 years of peace with the English. Peace was difficult. There was alcohol. There was the sale of firearms. There was Protestant evangelism. There was stray animals ruining crops. There was inequitable treatment under English law. And there was land, always land. But it was 40 years of peace nonetheless. David Silverman's This Land is Their Land makes a compelling case that Massasoit and the English each leveraged one another politically to gain advantage when necessary. Silverman is also part of the historical movement that I think of as the recovery of lost voices, in this case, those of indigenous people. It includes a book we mentioned earlier, Lisa Brooks's Our Beloved King. I would also add Christina DeLucia's Memory Lands and Ned Blackhawk's The Rediscovery of America. But Massasoit's death, his eldest son Wamsutta became Grand Sachem. The following year in 1662, Wamsutta was forcibly taken from his hunting lodge on Monposset Ponds in present-day Halifax by Josiah Winslow, who will become the governor of Plymouth Colony. Wamsutta was marched to officials to answer charges of the unauthorized sale of land and rumors of an armed uprising with the Narragansett. The new sachem apparently acquitted himself well, but became suddenly and violently ill and died on his return to his home in Warren, Rhode Island. We don't really know what happened. One modern doctor says that Wamsutta's symptoms resembled appendicitis. But Philip and many of the Pokanoket believed that Wamsutta had been poisoned by the English because they concluded he had become an obstacle to their acquisition of land. Wamsutta's hunting lodge was located near White Island in Halifax. There's a historical marker at White Island Road and Route 58 commemorating his capture. The next important event leading up to the war was the Taunton Agreement, signed at the meeting house of present-day Church Green, home today of the First Parish Church. This so-called agreement required Philip to give up his guns, a condition he undoubtedly agreed to only under threat, in which he would never honor. The scene of this meeting is depicted in New England Mutual Life Insurance calendar's 1900 promotional calendar. It's a beautiful engraving, but as you can tell, it's not particularly historical, as Philip is dressed like a 19th century Plains Indian. If you visit the Museum of the Ancient and Honorable Artillery Company at Faneuil Hall in Boston, you can see a painting of the scene of the Taunton Agreement. The third event, the one that really triggered the war, came about at the death of John Sassamon. Sassamon was a very interesting guy. He was a Massachusetts, a Wampanoag. He attended Harvard. He fought with the English in the Pequot War. He converted to Christianity, and he served as a translator for Wamsutta and for Philip. He was discovered in January of 1675 under the ice at Assawamsett Pond in Lakeville. First, his death was ruled an accident. He'd probably been ice fishing and fallen in. Then the English heard from an informer and came to believe that he had been murdered. You can see the eyewitness back there by the tree in this sketch. Plymouth held a trial. It was very much a kangaroo court. 3 of Philip's men were convicted and hanged, probably none of them guilty. So John Sassamon's trial will be the event that will convince Philip, if the poisoning of his brother and the Taunton Agreement hadn't already, that he will never receive justice from the English. The trial was well documented. It's fascinating. Dr. Kawashima, a historian and legal scholar at the University of Texas, wrote an excellent book on the events surrounding the trial and the nature of English justice as it applied to Native Americans. There was once upon a time a place called King Philip Tavern, built near the spot of the alleged murder. It burned to the ground in 1919. Years ago, I had a FedEx driver come up after a presentation and say that he had driven by that spot in the lake for 20 years and had never seen it frozen. So it was a reminder that our ancestors endured something that we now call the Little Ice Age, a regional cooling period from the 14th to the mid-19th century of something like 0.6 degrees C. So as we begin talking about the war and its sites, just a word of caution, what I'll call my Washington slept here caution. There are many sites and artifacts attributed to King Philip: rocks, caves, lookouts, even chairs. Just be appropriately skeptical. There are maybe a dozen accounts that were contemporaneous with the war, and there are 4 that contribute most of the material that we rely upon for location and landmarks. There's a history published by the Reverend Increase Mather. He's Cotton's father, the minister at Boston. He's a Puritan minister through and through, someone you might associate more closely with the Salem witch trials. He believed the English were placed by God in the New World to convert the heathens and possess the land. And that's the interpretation you'll get in his book. He rushed his book because there was only one printer in the colonies in Cambridge, and it showed in his lack of accuracy and thoroughness. The reason he rushed was that the Reverend William Hubbard, the minister here at Ipswich, was also writing a history, one that had been commissioned by the colonies. Hubbard's history included the Pequot War and followed King Philip's War to the north after it ended in southern New England. Hubbard had the advantage of being neighbors with Samuel Appleton, who led English troops in the Connecticut River Valley, and he led Mass Bay troops at the Great Swamp Fight. He was considered by some to be the finest English military commander of the war. So Hubbard had a great source of first-hand information. Samuel was also the original proprietor of Appleton Farms in Ipswich, which was operated, as you know, by 9 generations of the Appleton family before it was deeded to the trustees of the reservation in 1998. And then there's the entertaining history of Benjamin Church of Little Compton. He's America's original Daniel Boone or Natty Bumppo. who led the soldiers that killed Philip in modern-day Bristol, Rhode Island, and captured Anawan in modern-day Rehoboth. Church's history does not have the same Puritan perspective as Hubbard or Mather. In fact, he had good relations with the Secaucus and Little Compton and their Sachem and Washoms. He believed the English and the Native Americans could and should live together in peace. And we also have the captivity narrative of Mary Rowlandson, the minister's wife, who was kidnapped during the attack on Lancaster and held for 11 weeks by the Native Americans. Her book became a bestseller in the colonies. None of these books look like the footnoted modern histories we're used to. All contain errors, but they were contemporaneous with the war and written by people who lived through it and in one case fought it. So if Mather, Hubbard, Church, or Rowlandson mention a rock or a cave or a garrison, I generally take it as the most reliable source that we have. Conversely, if you find a location or artifact not mentioned in these accounts, just be skeptical. Undoubtedly, they first appeared as a secondary source given by a speech by a minister at the centennial history of the town. And I will talk a little bit about how Philip was treated and some of the cachet that he has that people would want to have a local site associated with him. Let me give you one example. This was King Philip's oak that grew on Somerset Avenue in Taunton. 1926, the Daughters of the American Revolution placed a plaque on the tree commemorating it as the spot where Philip and his people met. In 1973, the tree started to drop limbs. A decade later, Taunton's Park Department was forced reluctantly to take it down. People were very upset. This was a direct living link to King Philip. But when they counted the rings on this beautiful old tree, they found it had been planted about a century after Philip died. I was at King Philip's Cave in Norton a few weeks ago and took these pictures. Don't get me wrong, these places that bear Philip's name are still fun to visit, and who knows, maybe he did hide here at one point. But there's a Philip's Cave in Sharon, there's a Philip's Cave in New Bedford, there's a King Philip's Cave in Avon, Connecticut. And I was doing a little bit of research. I stumbled upon this Philadelphia Inquirer ad from June 7th, 1970, which lists as one of the must-see sites for Bristol County as King Philip's Cave in Freetown, which I have to go find because I didn't know existed until now. I had been to Freetown earlier this year to check on Profile Rock, which you know is no more, but I did not stumble upon the cave, so more detective work. I used to get home from a day of researching King Philip's War, and my wife would ask, "See any good rocks today?" So in her honor, earlier this year, I wrote a blog post for Old Colony on the 8 rocks you need to know. There's also the opposite problem with certain sites and artifacts. There are, for example, artifacts that we think must be associated with the war, but we can't quite anchor them in time and place. The Robbins Museum has this gem, which you referred to, or Mass refers to as the original Molotov cocktail. It was picked up in Rainham along the Taunton River and associated with the Leonard family of ironworkers who were friends with Philip. Occasionally, someone will ask me what King Philip looked like. It's a good question. The answer is we don't know. There was no contemporaneous image made of him. There are lots and lots of images out there of Philip. The one in the middle is owned by the Haffenreffer, and they were kind enough to allow Mike Tougias and I to use it on the cover of our first edition. Some of the images of Philip are striking. The painting in the middle was done by Thomas Hart Benton in 1922. And over time, I have developed kind of a back of the envelope theory of how Philip has been treated in American history. First, he was demonized. Hubbard refers to him as a savage miscreant, and Benjamin Church calls him a doleful, great, naked, dirty beast. And it's not uncommon in a shooting war for one side to demonize the other. But after the American Revolution, when fighting to protect your homeland against an occupying force seemed like not such a bad thing to do, Philip was romanticized. In 1820, Washington Irving wrote Philip of Poconoke, a very sympathetic portrayal of Metacom. And in 1829, John Augustus Stone wrote Metamora, or the Land of the Wampanoag, starring this man, American actor Edwin Forrest, in the lead role. In this telling of King Philip's War, Metacom is heroic and he's noble. He turns to violence only because he has to. The play was an instant hit and earned record profits in theaters around the country. So then, after being demonized and romanticized, Philip was commercialized. And he wasn't alone. Once the indigenous people were no longer felt to be a threat in America, around the turn of the 20th century, they were co-opted by Madison Avenue as brands in consumer marketing. So images of Philip were used to sell beer and chewing gum and coffee and tobacco, cigars, banks, and clipper ship services, even posting Kellogg cereal. And as you can see on these labels, marketeers in the 20th century were doing what New England Metropolitan did for its 1900 calendar. They're relying on Geronimo or Sitting Bull or Crazy Horse or some other 19th century model for their image of a 17th century sachem. It would be like us using Ulysses S. Grant as a model for Miles Standish. The most recent image of Metacom was unveiled a few weeks ago in the open area beside the 133 Club in East Providence. It's a mural. I'll get to visit it on Thursday and get some pictures of the finished work. The most famous of Phillips' images was done by Paul Revere in 1772. It's not very flattering. Historians wondered where Revere dreamed this up. And about 200 years later, a historian by the name of Brad Swan was visiting the American Antiquarian Society in Worcester and spotted hanging on the wall a mezzotint called the Four Kings of Canada. It's a display of 4 Mohawk chiefs done in 1710. Here are 2 of them. What Revere did was what we would call today a mashup. He borrowed and mixed elements from each. We're not privy to much of Phillips' thinking before or during the war. We're not always entirely sure where he is or what role he's able to play, or what influence he's able to exert. But we don't believe, and when I met with Nada Pashman 30 years ago, that he would have wanted hostilities to begin right at the start of planting season. So when the war began in Swansea in June of 1675, it may have been without Phillips' consent. On June 1st, the Sassamon verdicts were delivered in Plymouth, and on the 8th, the first executions were carried out. On June 19th, the home of Job Winslow was vandalized by Pokanoket warriors. Job happens to be the nephew of Josiah. There's a connection there. On June 20th, the band Pokanoket loot and set fire to several homes at Kickamuit in Swansea. And on June 21st, Governor Winslow orders 200 troops to assemble in Taunton and Bridgewater. And then on June 23rd, I suppose you could say the war began that day when the Pokanoket were looting and John Salisbury shot one of the Pokanoket who would subsequently die. And on June 24th, in retaliation, Salisbury and 8 others were killed and their heads placed on pikes in Swansea. Very quickly, the old Miles Garrison in Swansea became the center of action. Unfortunately, that structure is now gone. This picture was taken in 1906. You can visit the spot, of course. There's a marker near the intersection of Old Providence and Barneyville Roads. In our book, we transcribed the marker. You can see by the names that both John Salisbury and his father, William, were killed in the opening days of the war. Another picture of the garrison there on the right. From this point on, events take on a life of their own. English troops tried to trap Philip on the Mountain Peninsula. He's too fast, he's too smart, and the English are just too tentative at the start of the war. We now know that Native Americans readily adopted the flintlock prior to the war and used it frequently for hunting. They acquired the technology from the French and from the Dutch and from the English, who weren't supposed to sell them guns, but did anyway. Meanwhile, the English farmers, who were now soldiers, generally possessed the older, less reliable matchlock. So the natives were probably more skilled with a superior European technology than the English were at the start of the war. And the fighting will bear this out. Pat Malone is a professor emeritus at Brown who wrote an excellent treatise on how warfare might have unfolded in King Philip's War. Taunton was first attacked in June 1675. Several townsmen were killed, but the first and most famous was Edward Babbitt, who was living in modern-day Berkeley. At the first sign of trouble in Swansea, Babbitt had been able to walk his wife and their 9 children to the safety of the garrisons closer to the Taunton Green. However, the story goes, he and his dog returned to their home to get a cheese press, of all things. They were spotted by Pokanoket. Edward climbed a tree out of sight, but his dog barked and gave him away, and Babbitt was killed. His neighbors placed a crude gravestone near the spot, which is now in the collections of the Old Colony History Museum in Taunton. As you can see, the stone is still prominently displayed. If you drive along Berkeley Street, there is a marker that shows the original spot of the Babbitt stone. And by the way, the original stone was later used to build a stone wall and was rescued by Edward's descendants. So it's a good reminder of how fragile our history is and how easily it can be lost. In July of 1675, the following month, Middleborough was attacked. Town people were gathered for protection at the old fort, which was near the former Memorial High School. Their leader was John Thompson, who brought along his so-called long gun, a 7-foot 4-inch fowling piece that was designed to be shot from a a forked stand. In June of 1843, Thompson's long gun had come into the possession of one of his descendants, a Zadok Thompson of Halifax. And he told this story to the newspaper where it was published. He said, the natives would appear daily on the southeasterly side of the Mascot River and ascend what was called Hand Rock because it had the impression of a man's hand inscribed in it. There they would be within sight of the fort. Then the Indians would present their seat of honor to the people on the fort and would slap their hand on it. This they did for several days. So Lieutenant Thompson ordered Isaac Howland, who was a distinguished marksman, to take the long gun and shoot in the direction of the natives, answer their insult. When Howland shot, the story goes, he actually hit and killed one of the natives. The distance was later measured to be half a mile. We think that a fowling gun like Thompson's could shoot 50 or maybe 100 yards. So we put this story in the category of myth or tall tale. But the gun is real and often visited by gun collectors. It's displayed today next to the Bobbitt Stone. The museum has in its archives an excellent collection of material related to the gun. And hand rock, of course, exists. This is a beautiful petroglyph carved on that rock. If you have an interest in petroglyphs, then there are several hand carvings in Middleborough, along with hand rock, also on Betty's Neck in Lakeville and in North Kingston, Rhode Island. And Edward Lennox wrote an excellent article in your spring 2016 bulletin about this subject. Also in July, Mendon was attacked. It's a big deal because it's the first town in Mass Bay that's attacked. So both colonies, Plymouth and Mass Bay, are now fully involved in the war. The Nipmuc lead this attack. So they are now in the war alongside the Wampanoag, and they bring numbers and some very able commanders. Governor Leverett was not fully convinced the Nipmuc had joined the war on the side of the Wampanoag, so he sent a negotiating party under Captain Edward Hutchinson and Thomas Wheeler to meet with the Nipmuc in what is today New Braintree, Massachusetts. Their party was ambushed, 8 were killed and 5 wounded. Wheeler survived, and a few months later wrote a first-hand account of this ambush with enough clues to allow historians over the years to propose 3 possible locations for the ambush. And for historical detective work in the sense of place, it's hard to beat the search for Wheeler's surprise. Mike Tougias and I included Wheeler's first-hand account in our book, and local historian Jeff Fisk, who lived in New Braintree, wrote a careful review of all the clues as well. The Society was also kind to print our discussion of Wheeler's surprise in its fall 1999 bulletin. The survivors of the ambush raced back to Quaboag Plantation in today's West Brookfield along Fosterville Road. The Nipmuc were right behind and laid siege to the Ayers garrison. This siege was made famous by clergy historians who were looking for any angle possible at this time to tell something positive was happening in the war, because the natives tried to light this cart on fire, push it into the garrison, and smoke the English out, and at the last minute, a thunderstorm broke out and put the fire out. The sites associated with the plantation and siege are well marked along Fosterville Road in West Brookfield, including the location of the Ayers garrison. And in the late 19th century, marketeers attempted to cash in on the romance of King Philip's War by bottling water for upscale diners in Boston and New York City hotels. By the fall of 1675, action had moved to the exposed settlements along the Connecticut River Valley, with the Pocumtuck now joining the Wampanoag and Nipmuc. In September, Captain Richard Beers of Watertown and 36 mounted men led an ox team removing food and supplies from Squaw Key Plantation, which is modern-day Northfield, which had been attacked and burned. Beers and his men were ambushed, losing 21. As you can imagine, it was a very dark day for the English. That tragedy was followed by another ambush, this time at Muddy Brook, which will forever after be known as Bloody Brook in modern-day South Deerfield. Captain Thomas Lathrop from Beverly and 79 soldiers, most from Essex County, were sent to evacuate Deerfield. The soldiers and teamsters stopped to rest and were ambushed. The Nipmuc under Mutwump killed 40 soldiers and 17 teamsters. It was another devastating loss for the English in terms of human loss, of course, but also they lost the harvested food. And at this point in the fall of 1675, there was a sense among the English, the Native Americans might very well push 50 years of colonial settlement back to the beaches of the Atlantic. There's a marker showing the mass grave of Lathrop's soldiers and teamsters. The site was discovered many years after the event. This commemorative stone, which is now in the front yard of this home, is considered the oldest surviving monument to veterans in the United States. And in 1838, the site was commemorated with an inscribed memorial Edward Everett was the keynote speaker. He'd been the governor of Massachusetts, and except for Daniel Webster, was the greatest orator of his day. To give you some sense of how important King Philip's War still was in the 19th century, Everett would not only speak here at Bloody Brook, but he spoke at the dedication of the Lexington Concord battlefields, spoke at Bunker Hill. He helped raise money to save Mount Vernon, and then one day he would deliver 13,000 words at a place called Gettysburg, just before Lincoln delivered his 272. The first year closed with a single bloody stay of the war. The Great Swamp Fight occurred on a snowy day in December of 1675, when a 1,000-man army that included all three colonies, Rhode Island, and about 150 friendly Mohican warriors, attacked the palisaded Narragansett village of men, women, and children in the Great Swamp in South Kingston, Rhode Island. The story, as told by the Puritan historians, was that the fort was unfinished and the English entered it by a fallen tree at an exposed opening. It seems more obvious when I read the accounts that this entrance was intentionally created by Cnopchett, the Narragansett commander, to ensure that a larger and stronger force would have to attack single file. And that's what happened. The English broached the fort, but were driven back. They attacked again, but were driven back, and finally entered the fort in force. Once the fighting moved within the fort, the English set it on fire. Everything was destroyed: shelter, food, supplies. As many as 400 women and children. The Narragansett, who had not entered the war yet, considered this attack unprovoked and the massacre of innocents. And this depiction of the Great Swamp Fight on the right also hangs in Faneuil Hall at the Museum of the Ancient and Honorable Artillery Society. The site of the Great Swamp Fight is marked today by an obelisk. There is a long-standing debate about whether we have found the correct location of the battle. There have been artifacts found at this site and a sketch done by Yale President Ezra Stiles when he visited in 1782. But when archaeologists had dug test pits in this area, which they did in the late 50s and early 60s, the pits did not contain the kind and amount of rich remains you would expect to find in a palisaded village of maybe 1,000 people. There are archaeologists in Narragansett who say they know the correct spot, but won't reveal it as it is considered sacred. When I researched the book years ago, I took these pictures. You can see a change in the foliage, which indicates a change in the species of the tree, which in this case indicates sandier soil, about 5 acres of upland there. There are at least a dozen areas of upland like this in the swamp. And it stands to reason that if the water table is anything like it was then, and it's not clear that's true, that the fort would have been built on one of them. 2 years ago, my wife and I were able to purchase artifacts found at the traditional location of the Great Swamp Fight by descendants of the Clark family that owned and farmed the area around the obelisk. In the early part of the 20th century, I understand you could get off the train in Kingston, walk over to the farm, pay a quarter, and they would give you a shovel, and you could dig to your heart's content. And we donated these artifacts to the New England Historic Genealogical Society a few years ago. Okay, in the spring, February 1676, Lancaster was attacked, and the minister's wife, Mary Rowlandson, was captured. Mary would travel with the natives for 11 weeks. During that time, she met Philip, she met Weetomo, and she would be among the first to understand that despite this series of impressive victories by the Native Americans, they were actually growing desperate and hungry, often winning on the battlefield, but losing the war of attrition. The site of the Rowlandson garrison used to be marked by this pine tree. Here it is in 1906, and it was still hanging on when I visited in the 1990s. On the grounds of Atlantic Union College. The school closed in 2018, and the pine tree is also gone. If you want to visit the spot where Mary was released by the natives or redeemed, you can hike the Mid-State Trail on Wachusett Mountain near Westminster and visit Redemption Rock. Springtime brought the Sudbury fight. It's another devastating loss for the English, but what we now think of as the dying gasp of the Native coalition. Captain Samuel Wadsworth and Samuel Brocklebank marched their troops into town. They were ambushed, they regathered, they fought their way up Green Hill. After about 4 hours of fighting, they reached the top of the hill with very little loss, but this time the natives set the hillside on fire. And in the ensuing chaos, Wadsworth, Brocklebank, and 27 of their men were killed. The English soldiers were buried in a mass grave in what is today the Wadsworth Cemetery in Sudbury. Captain Wadsworth's son, Benjamin, was 6 years old when his father was killed. In 1725, Benjamin became the 8th president of Harvard. And in 1730, he added this beautiful slate stone in memory of his father and Captain Brocklebank and their men. In 1835, the cemetery was created around the burial spot, and on the 175th anniversary of the battle, this tall commemorative obelisk was dedicated. So as we come to the end of the war, quick recap. Dozens of English towns had been attacked. 17 were destroyed and abandoned. Meanwhile, the colonial troops kept walking into these devastating ambushes like Wheeler's surprise. Major Appleton had been able to secure the Connecticut River Valley, but only after Beer's ambush and Bloody Brook proved the worst days of the war for the English. Puritan historians are going to count the Great Swamp Fight as a win, but that's highly questionable. The English suffered 70 dead, 150 wounded, and managed to bring the powerful and before this neutral Narragansett into the war. When spring 1676 rolled around, the natives continued to win in places like Sudbury. On the surface, it looked very bad for the English. Certainly in the coffee houses of London, all of our venerated forefathers were being cast as these bumbling bureaucrats. But in truth, the natives were losing the underlying war. Harvest had been impossible in 1675. Planting was impossible in 1676. There was hunger everywhere among the natives. They had talented blacksmiths who could repair guns, but they were running out of gunpowder and had no way of making it. The natives were also running out of warriors, and when Kenosha was captured in the spring of 1676, they were also running out of military commanders. Death blow came in August of 1676 when Philip was shot and killed at Mount Hope in Bristol by a band of soldiers under Benjamin Church. Ironically, it was a Native American by the name of Alderman who killed Philip. One of Philip's hands had been scarred by an accident with a musket, and the scar made the hand identifiable, so Church cut it off and gave it to Alderman, who would preserve it in a bucket of rum and make his living by exhibiting it for pennies at taverns around New England. And Philip's head was sent to Plymouth and exhibited on a pike on a main thoroughfare for what we think was 20 or 25 years. The spot of Philip's death in Bristol is marked, as is the rock formation nearby called the seat of Metacom. Not long after Philip's death, Church and his men captured Anawan in modern-day Rehoboth. It's a heroic scene in Church's book. He has to carefully climb down this rock face in the dead of night. But it's also worth remembering that Anawan was elderly. He'd been Massasoit's war chief. So maybe 70, maybe an 80-something is leading mostly women and children who were outgunned and probably starving. So yes, Church is a hero, but you have to be a little skeptical of the details. For example, you remember our friend Ebenezer Pierce. He helped Zerviah Gould Mitchell write the history and genealogy of Massasoit. This is Ebenezer's military code at the Old Colony Museum. It tells its own story. As you can see, Brigadier General Ebenezer Weaver Pierce fought with the 29th Massachusetts Infantry, and in June 1862, lost his right arm to a cannonball at the Battle of White Oak Swamp. So when I read this passage to you from Pierce and Gould's book, you'll understand what he's saying. I'm 19 years older than Captain Church was when he performed this feat that has been wondered at and applauded for more than 200 years. And in that 19 years, I have grown, as Church would express it, ancient and heavy, as well as clumsy. He had 2 strong arms and 2 very active hands, while I have but 1 arm and 1 hand, and that an awkward left one. And yet I passed down the rock and passed up again without the aid of boughs or bushes, and in fact experienced less difficulty in doing so than in getting over many an ordinary stone wall. So we get only bits and pieces of the Native American perspective in King Philip's War. This passage provides just a little insight into how different the interpretation of the war might be if we had the perspective of both sides in equal measure. We think that as Church grew older, he visited Anawan Rock to show the scene to his family members. It's still a great place to visit, and you can try scaling down the rock with 1 hand, though I don't recommend that. Finally, there's the mystery of belts, right? When Anawan was captured, he presented Church with 2 wampum belts. Church described one in detail, 9 inches broad, black and white wampum, flowers, birds, and beasts, edged with red hair from Mohawk country. Church sent these belts to Governor Winslow, who in 1677 sent them to Charles II in courtesy of Winslow's brother-in-law, his wife's brother, Major Waldegrave Pelham. They never made it to the king. Pelham was in debt. He is the key suspect in this mystery. A group traveling to England in the late 1970s tried to find them. Doc Robbins was working on locating them right up to his death in 1990. Greg and I grabbed his correspondence the other day to take a look at it. In 1993, a photo surfaced of wampum belts held by the British Museum, but 2 years later, the British government was unable to find them. I'm sure these belts exist. There was also a belt created a few years ago in homage to the missing belts, part of an exhibit at the Cahoon Museum. Losses from King Philip's War on both sides were staggering. The English experienced 800 deaths, or about 1,500 deaths per 100,000 people, while the natives experienced death at 10 times that rate. King Philip's War is sometimes referred to as the bloodiest war per capita in American history. As important, though, these combined losses ended forever a way of life, of two peoples living peacefully side by side for 50 years in New England. Some Native Americans fled to New York, some to Canada, many were executed, and many were sold into slavery in the West Indies. So King Philip's War will become a template for the forceful removal of Native Americans from the land. King Charles II and the British administrators were appalled that our heroic ancestors could not keep the native population in check and almost lost the King's New World holdings. So shortly after the war, the Crown began tightening governance around a part of the world it had almost ignored for 50 years. Among other actions, for example, it forced the Treaty of Casco and it lumped Mass Bay and Plymouth colonies together into the province of Massachusetts. From the colonists' perspective, however, they just fought a war and won it without any help from the mother country. They were pretty happy about governing themselves for 50 years. Things were going okay in their opinion, and they will resist this tightening for the next century. You can see the seeds of the American Revolution being planted in the wake of King Philip's War. And finally, there is our shoddy treatment of veterans, another legacy of King Philip's War. As Mass Bay and Plymouth Colony soldiers were mustering on Dedham Plain, which is now the High Park section of Boston, before the Great Swamp Fight, a message had come from the governor. If they took the Narragansett Fort, they would be given a gratuity of land along with their wages. That was December 1675. Well, they took the fort. Unfortunately, it would take Massachusetts 59 years until 1734 before veterans and their heirs received the land promised in 1675. And I say heirs because there were only a handful of veterans of the battle still living in 1734. There were 7 Narragansett townships established, towns that would be settled mostly by the children of the soldiers at the Great Swamp Fight. Genealogically speaking, this information can be of great value. If you are from this area, land grant number 3 may be most relevant. That's the grant that became Amherst, New Hampshire. This information was captured in an 1892 book by George Madison Bodge. He was a school teacher, a Civil War veteran, a minister at Dorchester and at Westwood, and a historian of King Philip's War. Bodge researched and transcribed John Hull's account books, and Hull was the treasurer of Mass Bay during the war. So if you got paid in Hull's book, it's a pretty good indication that you fought. If you want to visit Narragansett Township number 4 to see Greenwich, we talked about this at dinner, where your King Philip's War ancestors settled, you will be disappointed as the town was flooded in 1938 and is now under the Quabbin Reservoir. Which is a good opportunity for me to plug my co-author, who wrote a terrific book about the Quabbin. In fact, after co-authoring King Philip's War, he was working in insurance at the time. Mike has gone on to write 30 books. He's a one-man marketing machine, a great speaker, and one of the really good people I've met because of King Philip's War. So thank you for inviting me. Thank you for dinner. Thank you for your kindness and listening.
So I think we'll take questions now. So if anyone online has any questions, you can put it in the chat and I'll relay it. And if anyone from our audience.
Just an observation, the shot across the lake, they said was a half mile. A smoothbore musket would throw a ball that far, but the Indian just happened in the wrong place at the wrong time. No way to be any kind of accuracy beyond.
It would have to be one of these, right?
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, like a missile.
Would have been a long walk, but if you could throw it that far, it could kill somebody, but he was just in the wrong place at the wrong time.
The original myth was that when he fell, he touched the hand with the rock, and that's what caused and it's a perfect hand. It's on private property now, so you have to ask permission to see it, but you can still look at it. The high school kids in Middlebar used to drink there. And so one of them colored it in red the day I went and took pictures, so it stood out very nicely in the pictures. But
And you should mention that your books are here for sale as well. So
books are $15. I'm happy to autograph or inscribe them to anyone you want or to you.
Question?
You said it, Phillips, head was spiked or, hey,
It was cut off and it's put on a pike, right, on a main thoroughfare in Plymouth. Tom had gone to Tom, and those original Swansea settlers had been right along Kickamute. So, and it was Cotton Mather in his diary, about 20 years later, writes that he traveled to Plymouth and saw Philip's head still on the pike. It was there at least 20 years. Yeah.
You know the English custom, they didn't bring it all the back.
Philip was considered a traitor to the king, so he wasn't allowed a burial. So they quartered him, they cut off his hand and cut off his head. It was pretty gruesome. You know, the thing that I think about Philip is that the way this narrative goes is Massasoit presided over 40 years of peace, and then Philip put together a coalition and went to war. But Massasoit died in 1671, and Philip went to war in 1675, and those 13 or 14 years were some of the hardest years to keep the peace, and Philip did that. So Philip to me was a peacemaker as well as, and again, I'm not sure he was ready to go to war when his men sort of took over events, so to speak.
Was it documented that way that they actually initiated that, or is that sort of comes out of the earlier colonial history?
It comes out of the colonial history, but there's some good. So the former governor of Rhode Island, a guy named John Easton, meets with Philip just before the war starts, and he basically records what Philip says. And when you read what Philip said, you do not hear, I don't hear anyway, someone who's ready to go to war. He says to Easton, treat my people the way my father treated your people when you were weak and we were strong. It was almost a pleading kind of, can't you be fair with us? Why are you killing my men under English justice when they don't deserve it? Kind of thing. So it was more of an appeal. And I think what happened was, I'm not exactly sure what tipped it off. It may have been relatives of the 3 men who were executed. And the execution in Plymouth was done. 2 of them were executed, and then the 3rd one was given a stick. Actually, the rope was put around and the rope broke. And miraculously, he's alive. And he was executed a week later. But at that point, he says, yes, those 2 did it. I mean, what does he have to lose? They're dead. So they got their admission in a very, very underhanded way and then killed them anyway. So at that point, you could see some of his relatives who were maybe in war in Bristol, Rhode Island, wanting to get vengeance.
It's sort of like a coerced confession, though.
Exactly.
Same time.
That Dr. Kawashimi's book is worth. I know I don't want to load up your nightstand with too many books, but there's. And at the time we wrote this book, and it was published in 1990, it had been pretty much a forgotten war. Russell Bourne had written Red King's Rebellion, and Douglas Leach had written Flintlock and Tomahawk. But now there's a lot being written about it. I mean, it's really become very active. So it's kind of nice. You're getting a different perspective. David Silverman says in his book, This Land is Their Land. It's not that the native voices didn't exist. It's that you have to work at getting them. Yeah, because they are tipping their hand about what they're thinking at various times. So if you spend some time and spend some time with indigenous peoples and talk to them, you can start to tease out some of the voices there. It's not as easy as having it down by Mather or Hubbard, but it's possible.
Nothing in the chat?
No.
I have another question for you. You talked about some of these locations. Do you know if any of them have been archaeologically confirmed, or are they just basically sort of anecdotally, historically confirmed?
Most are anecdotal. Yeah. And I'm not sure what, so for example, Wheeler's surprised me with one, but I'm not sure there's anything that archaeologists can do with that. It's a rise on a hill where they're ambushed. There are 3 rises in New Braintree with answer to the description kind of thing. So it wasn't like there was a camp there or a garrison or there was a major battle.
But you know, the work that Kevin McBride has been on some of these same sites
Well, he's done a lot in the Great Swamp.
in this Great Swamp.
Yep. There's a good report done in the south, you can go down to South Kingston and see it there. But, you know, good archaeologists, like, you know, good birders, when you see the first snowy owl of the season, you don't report where it is, because you don't want 4,000 birders showing up to harass the owl. It's the same thing with archaeologists.
Right. Sure. Are there any other questions? Then I'd really like to thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you, everyone. We'll see you next month.